As we move into a new year, I'm guessing that you might be checking out sparkly new planners, thinking about setting goals for 2024, or maybe reflecting on your 2023. And if you happen to have ADHD, especially, this time of transition from one year to the next can be a flurry of all sorts of practices, tools, attempts to change, etc., that sometimes fall off by February or just feel really overwhelming. So whether you have ADHD or not, this video is going to be an ADHD-friendly approach that I take to year-end practices. So sit down, grab a beverage, and we'll talk a little bit about some of my favorite ways to approach, especially for ADHD brains, looking back on 2023, moving into 2024, and how you can make this joyful and restorative practice rather than a bunch of overwhelm. If you're new to this channel, hi, my name is Avery, and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust as we grow into our emerging future. And right now, that future is 2024, so let's talk about it. When I think about this kind of pile of end-of-year stuff, I'm really thinking about 4 different areas that I think maybe is just helpful to kind of set the stage for this topic. So the way that I've divided this up is into reflection, review, ritual, and planning. So we're going to talk about, to some extent, all 4 of those things. And for some of you, you might be more inclined to one direction or the other. Because I tend to work at the intersection of neurodivergence, nerdiness, systems, stuff like that, and metaphysical, spiritual, restorative kinds of things, my transition from one year to the next tends to include some practical stuff, as well as some more sort of spiritual or holistic or reflective kind of fluid stuff. So, this may be you, this may be not you. I'll try to leave timestamps below so that you can kind of figure out which sections of the video are relevant. Although I am going to integrate and weave these together to some extent as well, because I think that it just naturally happens. Dividing it up this way, I kind of have 2 more practical elements. So when I'm talking about review and I'm talking about planning, I'm thinking a little more of the kind of specific, detailed side of things. When I talk about reflection and I talk about ritual, I'm talking a little more about the more fluid, spiritual side. But frankly, that's not a hard line either, because of course you can do planning by the moon. There's also a little bit of a split between the first 2, reflection and review, to me are about looking back specifically at what has already happened, and then ritual is kind of the transition, and planning moving, or about the portal of moving into 2024, moving into a new year. The reason that I specifically wanted to flag this as an ADHD-friendly approach, that I think can work for other neurotypes, but if you're ADHD, this might be especially something you need, is that I found that my ADHD really gets involved at this time of year because of a few different things. Like, one is just the kind of impulsivity, right? Of, ooh, there is a shiny new planner. There's something I haven't tried. There can be like a novelty sort of thing that I think you can actually really tap into with ADHD about this time, because there's this sense ADHD brains tend to be attracted to what's novel and what's different. And so that there is this sense of like, we're resetting and we're considering doing things differently. We're looking at something new. We're looking at a period of time we might not have played with yet. So that can be actually pretty motivating to our brains to jump into. But the flip side of that is that we can kind of get into this place where there's like all these different things we want to explore and try, and we're not really thinking about like what it would actually mean to implement them going forward. Or we can grab a bunch of review or reflection type resources. If you've ever downloaded, 5 different year-end journals and then you're sitting here going, I have 3 weeks to do them. So sometimes the actual process of having an end of year practice can feel overwhelming, or it's, January 2nd and you haven't done it yet. That, by the way, is really why I created this pop-up limited time thing I'm doing. It's a 2024 Catalyst reading. So if you haven't heard about it, I'll just briefly tell you. There is a link below. So check it out. I am doing this thing I'm calling a 2024 Catalyst reading. And it is really designed for to be friendly to ADHD and other neurodivergent brains, and that it's not a big, like, detailed year ahead spread or a detailed astrological thing where you have to look at every month and you have to remember to look back at it every month. It's one reading that's fairly concise. It's a written reading that you can take with you. It's got images of cards in it as well, and reflection prompts that you can use throughout the year. And so it's really like a dive into the themes for you of the coming year, using a couple of cool techniques that I like to use in my yearly reset practice. And it's the way I designed it is really like in tune with some of what I'm going to talk about in this video in terms of just grounding in sort of bigger themes and in the flow of the year, and not trying to get like so into the details and into the weeds at a high level. And so if you think you could use some guidance and some, another perspective on your coming year, and you don't necessarily want to do that yourself, you just want to sit down and read something that I wrote for you, then I'd love to help you out with a little catalyst for your year. It's an intuitive, guided reading experience that you can check out in the link below, and that's just $66. It includes, like I said, reflection prompts and tarot card imagery, and it's combining tarot and astrology for you personally to pull together. So you can check that out below if you're interested. But I want to go ahead and dive into kind of each of these phases in my my approach to the reset from one year to the next. So let's just go in order. We can start, and this is not necessarily the order that you do them in, although I do find that for me, I personally like to kind of do some of the looking back stuff before I do the looking ahead stuff. So I like to give myself, and this is part of the ritual really, is giving myself a nice closeout feeling for the year. It's not necessarily that I do it on December 31st. In fact, often I'm doing the closeout steps around late November, early December. But I want to give myself a nice container where I can look back and reflect and then start thinking about the new year, because sometimes it's really easy. Like I said, we had this novelty approach. Sometimes we want to think about the new year first, but looking back can be really helpful. Just ground ourselves and to notice things and to observe things. So you don't necessarily have to do these phases can be very integrated and woven together, but that's generally the way I like to think of it, is looking back and then looking ahead. So when I say reflection, what I'm talking about here and why it's distinct from review, reflection to me is I'm thinking about the kinds of practices that are more looking back on how the year went for you, whether it's emotionally, energetically, journaling. It might be, in some cases, I think reflection and review can blend a little bit, but I'm more thinking, reflection could include things like, if you have a tarot journal or an astrology journal where you want to look over past readings through the year, you want to remind yourself sort of how the flow of the year was going. If you have just a regular journal, if you like to look through it, if you like to look back over maybe your social media or public things you posted over the last year. If you're somebody who creates content, a lot of people are doing end of year videos right now, right? So a lot of times that's sort of a natural. If you're creating content about your last year, you might think about, what are the books I read? What are the things I watched? Etc. So that can be part of reflection. It's not all deeply spiritual and meaningful. It can just be I just want to take note of what happened this year. But the distinction from review is I'm more thinking about how things have been working in terms of systems, practices, etc. So we'll get to that. But with reflection, there's a couple of specific tools that I tend to use. I do find that in each of these stages, when I'm thinking about ADHD brains, and I'm thinking about my own ADHD brain and my ADHD brain, I tend to, it's really easy for me to do a lot and to go really in depth, and especially to want to like track everything that happened. So there was this like craze for a while, I think it still is there, but around, what was the phrase everybody used? It was basically like life, I can't think of it, but it was life tracking essentially. There was a fun phrase for it. But this idea of like documenting, you know, what's my mood, what's my sleep, what's my this, what's my that, like using planners, using bullet journals, whatever, to track at a really high level of detail. And something that I noticed, I'm not saying that can't be useful, but something I noticed is like trying to have this data-driven life, is that like I've been a data professional for a long time, right? I could totally analyze the data. I've got the skills to analyze it, but a lot of times I would not find any interesting patterns, or I would find that like whatever it told me, like it was already not relevant. So basically like that the way I'm flowing through time, whatever's coming up for me in my present moment is often more meaningful than what were the days that I remember to drink enough water. And that's not to say that like tracking can't be useful for building a habit, but trying to kind of draw conclusions, I've found that like by the time, or something like tarot pulls, right, trying to like figure out what does it mean that I pulled this card this much this year, by the time I'm here, I'm already flowing into the future, if that makes sense. Like I'm already pulling whatever I'm pulling this month. Sometimes matters more. So if it's fun and meaningful to you, of course, feel free to include a lot of detail in your reflection. But I tend to go at a slightly higher level than that. And I'm more looking at highlights. I'm more looking at, you know, how did things feel? And also understanding that, like, we're going to get into this with planning, but ADHD brains are much better with proximate time than we are with, like, longer term. And that goes backwards and forwards. So I'm not going to remember, and everybody this is true, but especially ADHD, you know, I'm not going to remember what was going on in January as well as I'm going to remember what was going on in December. So I do think that often it's nice to build in these kinds of practices at a shorter time span, and we'll talk more about that with planning, but like just whatever I'm going to say in planning, you can apply back to this as well, is that like having reflection, review practices, you know, quarterly or monthly or whatever cadence works for you might be a better way to do it than trying to do it all at the end of the year. But if you do already have a practice, like this can be a good time, like let's say you do like a monthly spread in a bullet journal, or let's say you do, you know, some kind of monthly or quarterly like activity. Now you can look back at what you had in those summaries at the end of the year. The tools that I like, so the most detailed, I do like these, even though they're fairly detailed, but I've found them to be useful. So one is called Year Compass, and the other is called Unravel Your Year. And you can just Google those two things with the current year, you know, 2024, 2023 to 2024, and you'll find them. They're both free resources. I think Unravel Your Year, you do have to sign up for Susanna Conway's newsletter. But those are both kind of guided journals that will walk you through a practice of both reflection, review, and planning. So they kind of pull together several of these things. I think especially reflection and planning, these are good resources. The Year Compass, I know, like off the top of my head, the Year Compass kind of has you, and I think Unravel Your Year does this as well. I do both. That is totally unnecessary. I would pick one or the other. I kind of integrate the two. But the process is you sit down and it has you go through, you know, your calendar or whatever resources you have to like remember what actually happened in the past year. And then using that as a resource, you can kind of reflect on bigger themes and what came up. It has prompts like what was going on in different areas of your life. And some of these reflection things I think are both useful in the moment as just like marking the passage of time. It is its own ritual. And because sometimes our memories are not that great, I find these fascinating to read several years later. And I actually find these, one of the hidden like benefits of this kind of reflection is that I have found when I look at my old ones, it really helps to like help me really feel into the spiral of time, and the way that time is not like predictable, and you can't say like, I'm going to do it this year and I'll definitely do it. But if you look back at 5 years of those things or 10 years of those things, it's very funny the way you'll be like, oh wow, that totally happened, but in a different time frame than I expected. Or that came back this year. Or that, you know, you can see how these different themes and the things you were hoping for and the plans you were making and the you know, success, your view of your successes and failures is like certain things just don't matter anymore, and then other things that come back around. And so I find that to be just like also kind of a spiritual tool, in the sense that it helps you to feel into the values that a lot of us are trying to embody around time being non-linear and having more gentleness and forgiveness for ourselves. I think it could be nice to have that as a resource, something for reflection. I also like for reflection, so, you know, those kinds of journals, it does take a little bit of time to like sit down and do it. If you don't have that kind of time, or you just don't want to go at that level of detail, something that these journals have, but that you can also find separately in a million different places, guidance on, is coming up with something like a word of the year, or themes for the year, you know, things you want to feel into, overall themes. I think the word of the year practice is really great. And Unravel Your Year, actually, I think she separated it out now. The word of the year is like a separate little thing that goes with it. But that does definitely includes like a guided practice for coming up with your word. Just having one word is a great practice, because with, you know, sort of like what I was talking about with my catalyst reading and the way I wanted you to have kind of themes that you can take through, having something that's simple and concise that you can put in your space, that you could like make art of the word and stick it up in your space, that's something that's a lot easier to return to than a really detailed plan, you know. And so this is going from reflection forward, but the reason that I mention it in this reflection section is that looking back on your word of the year, that can be, if you don't want to do a full kind of review and reflection, it can be like, either you could come up with a word to represent the year that you've had, like what is it having happened, what is the word I would use to describe the year? Or you can, if you already had set one, you can ask yourself, you know, how did you feel into that word? How did you not feel into that word? You can use resources for reflection as well, like tarot year cards, like astrological perfection years, to just feel into like how that went. If you want to go more detailed, of course, you can look at, you know, how did the transits of the year in astrology play out for me. But if we're going higher level, I like things like that. Okay, so let's go to review next. So when I say review, I realize reflection and review sound very similar. But when I say review, what I'm specifically meaning in this context is reviewing what's working and what isn't. So this is sort of a little more on the practical side, and it's feeding into your planning. So I like my end of year to include, it's just a good touchstone point, a good time to ask yourself questions about systems, about processes, about approaches to things. Now, I think that, again, this is another place where I would say, if you only have one review of this stuff per year, it's going to be pretty overwhelming. So one of my tools to reduce overwhelm for ADHD is that I would really recommend that you do this kind of review of how things are working in a tiered fashion, so that you review some things on a weekly or monthly or quarterly basis, and then the end of year, I personally find, is really useful for the kinds of things that really need time to play out, the kinds of things that don't tend to change as much, as opposed to things that are a little more flowing and adaptable and change from time to time. So when I'm reviewing systems, it might be something like, an example, so I have like a bunch of I just have a checklist that I would go through each year. And I have checklists at quarterly level and on down. But some of the kinds of things that I might look at would be, I'll look through like my Notion, which is where I do a lot of my just organizing my life, and I'll be like, oh, what are things I never use anymore? Like, you know, just that need to be archived or deleted. Same thing for like looking through your hard drive. You know, I like to do that because your hard drive fills up. So it's like once a year is about the amount of time I can actually do this, where I go through and I'm like, okay, these are big files. Let's just like do something about that. It can be a good time to, this is part of the reflection, part of the review. Like big type things, we'll talk about planning, but I think there's also a review of like, once you've reflected, maybe part of your reflection might be, you know, what were the goals I had set for myself if you set goals, and how did the progress to those goals go? This bear does not want to sit there, so it's going to come down here. You know, you might be thinking about, did you kind of meet your own expectations, or how did it feel? Did you feel good about what happened this year and what you did and what you didn't do, or how those goals changed? The review piece can then be, part of it can be, did I like that process, right? Did my goal setting process actually work for me, or were goals not so great for me? This might be a point in which you realize, ooh, annual goals do not work well for my ADHD brain. I'm going to advise that they don't in a second. It might be a point at which you realize that the number of goals that you set, or just the like amount of stuff in your life, like I like to think about that in general, like what's the balance between my life areas, which might be something I reflect on and then review. You know, maybe it's like I need to let go of some commitments. I need to release. There might be some like goals that you didn't meet, or some like projects that have kind of been sitting there for a long time. And this could be a great time to say, you know what, I think that project's just not going to happen, or it's on indefinite hold. Things you wanted to learn or study, you know, bucket list items that have been like kind of weighing on you that you keep just not wanting to do. You can say, you know what, I'm letting this go now. I'm not going to do it. It can feel really good to clear your slate a little bit in December. And to just acknowledge that there are things. This is a time if you use, you know, like a someday maybe list. Someday maybe list isn't a list that you would review very regularly. But at the end of the year, it can be a good time to say, okay, what am I just going to drop and say, it's not a someday, it's a never. And then also we'll get into planning. You can look at what on someday is now this year. But those are kinds of things. You know, thinking about, I think it can be a good time for thinking about routines, systems. I do want to caution, though, that sometimes we put so much emphasis on the end or beginning of the year that I don't find this to be a great time. I say hypocritically because I definitely just turned over a big system in my life. But generally, I don't find this to be a great time to be like, I'm going to totally change how I do my routines. I'm going to change my planning. I'm going to change my, you know, like how I organize my life. It's often tempting because people are talking about it right now. But I think that because of all these things we're talking about, right? If you're doing reflection, if you're doing planning, if you're doing all these things together, maybe it's not the best time to do a big change like that. Maybe that kind of big change you can experiment with in phases during the year. But I don't usually, I might make a note of a system that I'm finding, I might review and say, I see a pain point here that I want to investigate through the year. But I usually would not say, let's blow the whole thing up at the end of the year. That's just me. It might be that for you that works, but I just find that it doesn't work that well for me. And yeah, I would just totally advise to like have a place where you, for any sort of system, process, tool you have in your life, think about how often you want to review that thing and add to a list. It can be a simple list, can be a complex, you know, like I have a Notion, but like make it a quarterly, make it a monthly, make it a yearly, and just take a little bit of like off of your end of year shoulders by giving yourself a different frequency, or even if it's annual, there could be some things that are annual that aren't the end of the year. From a spiritual perspective, I'll remind us all that like the calendar year is kind of arbitrary. I think it's a good time and in fact, let's go ahead and talk about ritual. I think that so ritual for me is about just acknowledging the transition from one year to another, and that can be as simple as what we've already talked about. That could be just doing these practices, or it could already be a ritual, right? Doing if you're doing like one of these journals or something, setting a word for the year, right? These are all like rituals. Opening up a new calendar, physical calendar, if you have one, or planner. So there's lots of ways to just, I think a ritual is just about marking the transition. It might be that you want to do a whole spiritual ritual. It might be you want to design a ritual for yourself, a letting go ritual, a release ritual, an inviting in ritual. I often do a ritual that's kind of like, one thing I would always write down when I had a bullet journal was like what I want to leave behind in the last year and what I would invite into the next year. And I might just like sit with that for a moment. That might be a ritual. But I want to acknowledge that this is not the important turnover for everyone, right? So like the calendar year starting on January 1st, I think it's not a bad time to do this stuff because it's convenient. It's like a lot of people get off some, work days at the end of the year. A lot of people are on vacation, and so you might have fewer people to have to communicate with at this time of year. But for some people, this is a really stressful time of year, and it's not when you want to do it. Other meaningful New Year's might be the Lunar New Year. It might be the spring equinox. It might be the fall equinox, right? Like different people. Maybe the Jewish New Year. Everybody kind of has their own like acknowledging. So you gotta choose what makes sense for you at this time of year versus a different time of year. Your birthday, right? There's lots of like dates that are yearly that you could pick for this kind of practice. And also, the year isn't the only kind of thing to ritualize and reflect on. So if the year is like too big for you, it feels really large, it might be that you don't think of your time that way. It might be that you're like, no, just every 12 weeks I do a ritual. But yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about specifically what the ritual is, just that I think it is useful to have some sort of practice of like, I acknowledge what's happened. So often it's like, you do the reflection and the review, and then you just say, this is what I've come up with. Now I'd like to invite in some new energy. Now I'm going to do some planning. Or you might do this, sometimes I will do the planning, and then I might do a ritual on the actual date of flipping over at the very end. So however it works for you. But then finally, the last thing I want to talk about is planning, which is maybe one of the biggest things. So we reflected, we reviewed, we've ritualized, we're moving into the forward, and then now we need to, what's the forward? What's next? What are we planning? What is happening? So I happen to believe that, especially if you have an ADHD brain, this is an area where you want to be careful. So I already mentioned that I don't like to start a lot of new systems. One of those is the planner thing. I know a lot of folks like want to get a shiny new planner, because this is when they go on sale, right? The new year comes out. And they often want to use a very different system than what they used before. They want to move to paper planning. They want to move from one kind of paper planning to another kind. Maybe they get an app at this time. I think that would probably be less like dependent on the year. And then it like kicks off a whole train of different things you want to do differently. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I've noticed it makes me sad to see how many people are like gung-ho for 3 weeks, and then it just all falls apart, and they just feel worthless, and they're like, well, I'm just not going to plan for the rest of the year. Like, I'm just going to live with it. And a lot of our brains, really neurodivergent brains, often cannot handle big blank portions of planners. So I think what I like to do when it comes to planning is a couple things. One is just like incremental change. So if you are doing sort of beginning of year planning, I wouldn't change it that much from what you're used to doing. Wouldn't implement necessarily a brand new system. I might add on a little bit, Or I might, if I'm starting from scratch, I might start a simple practice and then intend to build on it. So let's say like I've never done astrological tracking, probably buying the shiny new honeycomb planner, and those things are gorgeous, let me tell you, and they're awesome. And like if you want recommendations, I'll say Magic of Eye and Honeycomb make, and other people, but those are just ones that spring to my mind. Do make awesome tools. I do not doubt that. And also, if you've never done astrological tracking and now you're like, I'm going to track 16 planets. No, you're not. I think it's very unlikely. So I think starting with something like, it could be phases of the moon. I actually like to, do something a little, that happens a little less frequently sometimes. Phases of the moon works okay. I wouldn't necessarily do moon signs because they change every 2.5 days. I would pick things that you can track that have a little more space around them. Noticing the transits of the sun, noticing what's going on with moon phases, can be good places to start. Adding on one more planet, if you're already doing tracking, could be a place to start. If you want to do a tarot practice, saying like, I'm going to do a daily pull, if I've never done any tarot draw before, might be a little bit much. Or it might work for you, right? But like, often I try to like put it in a little more incrementally than that. So that's one thing. It's just like incremental. Another thing is that I think the beginning of the year is a good time for high level, or I guess I should say the year as a duration, like planning for the whole year. I think for most ADHD brains, I don't recommend setting goals for the whole year. I just don't. I don't think it's the worst thing to say like, oh, here's a vision of where I'd like to be. That can be fun too, to like write down, here's the vision. Those journals I mentioned in the reflection section were great for this because they're like, where would you like to be in a year? That can be really interesting visioning exercise. But I think hold that really lightly. I like to hold that lightly, and I like to say, here's where I imagine myself. And I think of it, I always talk in my practice about beacons. I think of it as a beacon I'm moving towards. I might go in a totally different direction, and that's great. Like, that beacon's purpose was to get me moving forward, and then I turned left, and that's fine. But if I had never moved forward, I would have never turned left. So, like, if you need something to move towards that's far on the horizon, totally fine. But I don't think setting, like, really concrete goals tends to work great at that level, because most ADHD brains really have trouble beyond about 12 weeks. Like, 3 months. It's really hard for us to think beyond 3 months. It's not that we can't think like, oh, here's my big vision, but once we just start trying to plan it out and figure out all the steps and imagine, it just, you start to go, oh God, no. So I would say this is a good time for setting broader intentions. I mentioned setting a word of the year, setting themes that you want to move towards, setting, it might be, here's a little menu of some projects, big projects kind of level, that I might like to touch this year in different areas of my life. Maybe I hope this will be the year that I learn Spanish. Maybe I'm hoping that this will be the year that I do a big home project. That level of kind of high level thinking, I think, works okay. Understanding that if your home project is planned for Q3, it's not a plan. It is just it is an intention for now. And then I don't like to go very granular for an entire year. I think if I'm thinking about specific intentions, specific results I want to get to, specific projects, I'm really more thinking in that 12 weeks or shorter. And so you might think about the next 12 weeks. One thing you can do with the planner problem that's related to this, so I guess like that's the second thing. The third, so the second thing is smaller scales of time, and considering this a quarterly process rather than an annual process of when you're doing your like real meaty planning. And I have a video about grid planning, which is one way that I've devised to think about this, that you can totally check out. But the third thing, which is related, is looking for tools that don't require you, like that aren't, this is for the year, and if I start it wrong, then I've failed. Looking for like planners, for example, that are undated. I like the Panda planner as one example of this. They do an undated planner, and so you could have a week that you put it in, and then you forgot it for 3 weeks, and then you do another week. Like, there's no punishment. There's no blank space. You don't feel like you're wasting paper. You know, you plan when you plan. I've also done a review on this channel of Imperfect Inspirations. They do like laminate sheet planners, so you can just erase last week. So if you don't need something that you keep, that's a great way to do it. A lot of planners, I think some of the ones I mentioned, I want to say Honeycomb does this. There are some that you can get, like, you can actually get 12 weeks, or you can get a 6-month planner. So not a full year planner. The ones that you can actually buy 3 months or 6 months, those are great if you're trying to do a totally new one or a new system, because it's like if you get to 3 months and you realize you were not really using it, now you can do something different. So that can work really well. But yeah, I think my big thing for thinking about the year ahead is that while you might want to have themes, core desired feelings is another one. I'm kind of on Danielle Laporte right now, but Danielle Laporte did this thing called core desired feelings that I do think works pretty well, which is more about how you want to feel than where you want to be or what goal you want to have. So thinking about how you want to feel, you know, words that you can come back to that are like very simple touch points are really good for the year. And then I think when you're thinking about intentions, new habits, practices, specific projects, specific task lists, etc., I would consider that more of a quarterly or monthly process. Now, if you don't already have that process, it's a perfectly fine time to let's do January, let's do Q1, right? This can be a really good, like, use that energy to try it, but then just make sure the next time you do it isn't a year from now. So this can be a good time to look at that someday maybe list and see what might I want to hit this year. It can be a good time to, I think I do this more than annually, but in general, it's good to like look at your tasks, your projects, and to review them on a regular basis, and to ask yourself what still feels present, what needs more time, what needs more space. What's the overall balance of my life feel like? Do I have the right amount of stuff in different areas? Do I need to clear some space, make some space? Do I need to set some limits or boundaries on myself? Maybe it's like no new buying courses till I watch all the ones I already bought. Maybe it's no books until I read the books I have. You may have heard of the concept of a depth year. It can be a good time to decide if you want to do a depth year this year and focus on what you already have. That doesn't have to be every year, but I do that some years. It can be a good time to set cadences going forward. So if in your review of your systems and such, if you noticed like, ooh, one of the things I noticed is that I'm not doing enough review and that something is falling off, you might want to put in your calendar. This is a good time to like put stuff in your calendar to say, I'm going to do this a little more frequently, or a little less frequently. I'm going to change the pacing of the systems that I use. Again, I wouldn't change it dramatically. I would like incrementally play with it. But that can be a good time. And so I do a lot of those things myself. I also, I think if you do planning, I will sometimes note things like some interesting upcoming transits and, astrologically, but I don't get super in the weeds. Again, I consider that more of like a quarterly thing, where every quarter I'll see like what's going on in the sky in the next 3 months. I don't usually look at the scope of the year, but you may find that as these like videos and blog posts and stuff are coming out about the astrology of 2024, maybe you want to look at one. Well, what I'll often do is I'll watch the first quarter's worth of it. I'll pause. I'll make a note of the timestamp, and then I'll go back later. I'll put it on my calendar to go back. So yeah, I think I'm like just checking in with myself, but I think that's pretty much complete. So that's kind of my overall approach. Some of the kinds of things that I like to do as we move into the new year. I like to give myself a lot of space, a lot of permission to not do everything that I wanted to do, to allow for that. Yeah, I didn't mention this, but like part of the ritual too might be doing your head spreads, doing tarot pulls, doing other kinds of things. But as I mentioned at the top, one way I like to do it is to look at a higher level. I look at my year cards, look at perfection year, and I pull a couple cards, and I've turned that into an offering that is available to you. So if you would like a catalyst reading for 2024, it's $66 written reading. Intuitive from me to you, includes card imagery, includes reflection prompts, and it's something that you can really carry throughout your year. Especially if you don't have time or space right now to do some of these like journaling and thinking and planning. It's like, I'll do a little bit of it for you. So love to help you out. So you can check out that link below. And I'd love to see it in the comments if you have thoughts about this. What are the practices for going from year to year that do and don't work for you, especially if you have ADHD, but really for anyone. Have you tried some of the resources that I mentioned in this video? Did they work for you? How did it go? And what's some guilt that you can release around whatever you intended to do at the beginning of this year that you didn't do? Because let me tell you, I don't care what that is. I don't care how big, I don't care how small, I don't care what the result was. You're okay. It's gonna be okay. We're gonna keep moving. And I give you permission to let that go. What's important is what's present right now. So that's the thought that I will leave you with. And I hope everyone has a very happy new year and a restorative end of 2023 and an exciting leap into 2024. We'll see you in the next video.